Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Mark Sharp. I'm the Director of Marketing with Red Bear Negotiation. And let's get started with today's session dealing with price pressure and negotiations. So before we get started, this recording will be available on demand after today's session. And please, throughout the session, whenever something occurs to you, please submit a question anytime. We'll be addressing some questions as they come up and also saving those for the end of the session as well. And then, as always, if you could, please give us some feedback at the end of today's session. That helps us in planning additional sessions in the future. So a little bit about Red Bear. We are a global performance improvement firm dedicated to maximizing the profitability of the agreements negotiated with suppliers, customers, partners, and colleagues. We've got consultants all over the world, and they deliver in over 15 different languages. So what do we do? In short, Red Bear transforms people, teams, and organizations into world-class negotiators. How do we do it? Well, through custom-tailored workshops based on discovery-based learning. So we mix a blend of theory and practice in order to give participants the opportunity to apply new skills and behaviors in order to translate those skills directly to their daily jobs. So as we get started and I introduce today's speaker, what I want to do is launch a poll question for us, and I'll get that up here in a second. What we want to start out by knowing is, what aspect of negotiation do you find more difficult? Is it being competitive, being collaborative, or being creative? And with that, I will introduce today's speaker, Andy Buergi. Andy, thanks for joining us.
Cool. Thank you. Thanks for the introduction. Yes, my name is Andy, or Andreas. Yes, this is better. You can actually see me. I'm based in Zurich, Switzerland. I work with Red Bear as one of the things that I do, delivering trainings throughout Europe, Middle East, Africa. Love it. I used to be a partner with PricewaterhouseCoopers, doing transformational training and consulting at the executive level. Since I've left PwC, I usually work with CEOs, with top executives to help them transform their business. And I found that has a very neat connection to negotiation. With Red Bear and with other organizations, I do a lot of training around leadership and negotiation. And I've trained about 20,000 salespeople and key account managers in recent years on advanced negotiation with Red Bear. But also, what I found interesting, I was able to train about 3,000 professional buyers, corporate procurement specialists, supply chain managers as well in recent years. And it comes to me that in the last maybe 2 or 3 months, one of the key topics that every time that I'm doing seminars or real deal workshops where we're working on live negotiations, the hot topic is price pressure. And price pressure seems to be something that both sales specialists and procurement people are dealing with right now. Both sides are having to improve their prices. There's a lot happening in the world right now, disrupted supply chains. There's a shortage of some key raw materials. The energy prices are skyrocketing. And so what I found is that salespeople are tasked to improve their pricing to pass on at least some of the pain, some of the increased cost of raw materials and production and logistics costs, energy costs. But buyers are also in a squeeze. They have to try and reduce cost base and reduce prices to have their companies stay competitive. This whole thing creates a lot of pressure. Most of the people I'm doing trainings and seminars and workshops with right now, they seem to be under a lot of pressure. And when that happens, people get into what we call the price mind frame, the mindset that focuses primarily on price. It's sometimes a little bit hypnotic even. I was doing a workshop recently with a major firm based here in Europe. It was a negotiation workshop, very advanced for their global directors of sales. And this sales director for Asia Pacific, he was giving me a hard time from day one. He was coming at me like, Andy, it's really about price and nothing but price. All of these things you're trying to do to teach me how to deal with price pressure, it's not working for me. When I talk to my clients, they only want to know about my price and that's it. He was giving me a hard time for 4 days. In the same meeting, the global head of sales was there as well. And she was very distracted. In one of the breaks, her assistant came up to me and said, Andy, you've got to forgive her. She's a bit frazzled right now. Our largest account, our key client, has just told us that they will only renew the contract if we give them a 10% discount by this Thursday. I said, okay, well, it's good for me to know. But in the lunch break, a second person came up to me and said, Andy, you have to forgive her. She's a bit distracted right now. Our major account has just told us they won't renew the business unless we give them a 10% discount by Thursday. I went, yeah, I've been informed. That's okay. But you know what? In the afternoon, another person came up to me and told me the same story. And I went, somebody's being clever. So framing is something that great buyers and procurement specialists do. Framing and anchoring creates a very clear focus. And it also triggers strong mental shortcuts or emotional hot buttons if you say you're going to lose this contract if you don't give me the price. So these people were so focused on trying to get the price right and trying to get the discount happen and trying to save the contract that they didn't really think of anything else. Framing is very powerful. It gets our thinking to go in one specific direction. And so price pressure can be quite hypnotic. It was interesting because I found the same thing happens on the other side as well. Recently, I've been doing a lot of training with some major organizations in the procurement and buying section of a large oil company. And they have said, you know what? A lot of our suppliers are trying to put us an allocation, and they're saying we can only guarantee the supply if you accept a % price increase. Actually, in some cases, this was 30%, so quite significant for them. And again, this was hypnotic. It was actually focusing their thinking. They were not actually able to think about anything else. Interesting, because price pressure very often is very limiting. This guy from Asia Pacific, the sales director of Asia Pac for this major corporation, have been giving me a lot of pain and grief for 4 days about our techniques not working, and it's really just about price. On day 4 in the afternoon, suddenly it felt like a light bulb lit up. He had this epiphany and said, Andy, I think I get it. It's not about the price, is it? I think my buyers really care about their cost. They want to reduce their cost. They're tasked to manage and get their cost base down. And if I can maybe help them to manage that cost, to find ways of saving or reducing cost, maybe they'll leave my price alone. I snickered and said, well, you'll be lucky, but I think you're onto something, because very often price is just a means to an end. Buyers typically don't buy a price. They buy a product, a service, a solution. Ideally, they're buying a result, an outcome, an effect that they can quantify and measure. Price is just a means to an end. And very often we limit ourselves to a monodimensional, a one-dimensional negotiation when we're talking only about price, which means we actually get blocked. We very often get into a dead end if we're focusing purely on price. So one of the key things is to reframe that discussion, to take it to a better place. Like this Asia Pac sales director who said, I'll go back and have a conversation about them reducing their cost structure and how we can help them with that. And then we'll see what we can do around the price. Actually, it seemed to work. I got good feedback from him later. So for him, I think the key thing was he had to change his mind first before he could help his clients to change theirs. This is what we call mindset management. If you're in a mind frame of focusing only on price, then pretty much everything else is unimportant. But if you can shift that towards a value discussion, a results discussion, an outcome discussion, then you have many more opportunities. It's not as black and white. It's not just take it or leave it. Value creation actually gives us a broader range of opportunities. We can look at what are the needs of the other side? What opportunities do we have for maybe cost savings? How can we maybe be more effective and efficient in our cooperation? How can we actually improve the solutions around total cost of ownership and total cost of use? Interestingly, I asked that sales director for Asia Pac, do you know how your clients, your buyers, your procurement counterparts, how they actually calculate and evaluate the total cost of use or total ownership? I have found very few salespeople actually know that. And if they know the generic template that their clients might be using, they usually don't know the weightings that are attached to each factor in the TCO or TCU model. So one thing to take away from today is if you want to break out of the price frame, you might have to do your homework about their way of evaluating cost and what weightings and factors they have in there. And that also leads us to ways of optimizing cost benefit. Because at the end of the day, very many procurement specialists and buyers I have worked with over the years, they're not really measured by just price reduction and discounts they can achieve. They're usually measured by how they can develop cost downwards, how they can manage cost and risk, but also in many organizations, how they can actually add value to the organization through access to innovation. So price, if we focus only on price alone, we find ourselves in a monodimensional negotiation, which very often gets us blocked, gets us stuck. One thing that I found is this monodimensional negotiation. Most people actually, when they're in that mode of thinking or mode of operation, we get to this place where we have a win-lose. If the buyers are good at their job, they will squeeze the sellers and get the price down. But that can come back to haunt you if you squeeze them too much. I've been working with major organizations recently that have squeezed their suppliers so far that they found they're getting very low prices, but very high costs. The opportunity costs, the hidden costs have been significant. Actually, one buyer recently said, you know what, low prices for me typically relate to high costs as an end result. And this organization has actually started to deselect all of the suppliers that come in with the lowest price. So they always deselect the lowest price bidder. I don't know whether that's best practice, but it does say something about people getting their hands burnt with low prices or maybe too much price pressure. It's a little bit similar on the other side. A lot of sellers now are actually pushing through price increases due to energy costs skyrocketing, due to raw material prices having gone through the roof, due to supply chains and logistics actually getting disrupted and becoming very expensive. So yes, you can push through those higher prices, but very often then, as soon as the market situation changes, the buyers will be breathing down your neck, asking you to squeeze down or bring down your prices again. So what? I see a lot of people in these negotiations saying we should focus on win-win. We should maybe, instead of only just looking for ourselves, we need to, in our relationships, find ways where both sides can benefit, where we're helping each other. And I like that approach. For many years, I was teaching the Harvard concept, the win-win approach, until in one major Swiss service organization, one of my top participants, he was the top producer in this Swiss financial services company. He said, Andy, win-win is for losers. I found that a bit rough. But then he said, no, don't get me wrong. I like win-win, but everybody does win-win. And so if I'm only doing what everybody else is doing, I'm no better than them. And that doesn't actually give me a competitive edge. So I try to go beyond win-win. That's what I like about the Red Bear programs. It's one of the key concepts that we use here. Instead of dividing up a finite pie, which is what we usually do if we're focusing too much only on price, what this guy said, I focus on creating and baking a bigger, better cake with my clients, with my customers. And that has made him the best producer in his organization. There's something there, I guess. And so what I have found is a key technique that we use at Red Bear and that this guy seemed to be using as well is to create a level of tension, not too much, but not too little. So a level of cognitive tension that gets both sides into a bit of a battle where both sides are fully engaged, both sides are trying to find a solution, both sides want a solution. But then there's an interesting thing that I learned when I was doing martial arts many years ago. My sensei, I was doing karate, full contact. I was 40 years of age when I started karate. My sensei would always pitch me in the dojo against one of the young guys, but these guys were maybe 24, 25 years of age with a black belt. I was just starting out. I got bloody noses, I got injured. I was having a hard time in the dojo. And my sensei took me aside one day and said, Andy, you're trying to fight this out physically, but they are stronger than you. They are fitter than you. They are better than you technically. You can't fight them at the physical level. Andy, you need to do this with your head. I said, you want me to do head banging? He said, no, that's not the point. You need to fight them with intelligence. You need to actually anticipate their moves. And instead of fighting them head on, you need to engage with them and then redirect their energy. Redirect them towards a place that you want them to go. I later learned that's a key technique in martial arts in the form of Aikido. So I often call this the negotiation Aikido, where what we do is initially we fight with our counterpart, whether it's buyers or sellers. We engage with them, we create a certain level of tension, but then the key is to disrupt the default ways of behavior, the default thinking patterns of my counterpart, and redirect their energy towards a better outcome. So we're not just talking about how do we divide up this pie that we've got in front of us, but how do we bake a bigger, better cake? How can we actually together go there? So this redirection is one of the key techniques at Red Bear that we use. And I found it to be very powerful because it takes me away from what people want, which is very often quite limited, quite finite. And it takes me towards why they do what they do. I'm trying to find out what they really need. I have found if I give people exactly what they want, very often they still are not satisfied. So I found that what I need to do is instead of focusing on what they want, I need to focus on why they want what they want. I need to redirect that conversation. Many years ago, when I was learning to drive my car, my driving teacher told me, Andy, when you're driving towards a place where there's danger, there's an accident about to happen. If you continue in that direction, you focus on that, then you're actually going to go straight into the accident. You can't avoid it. So what he said, what you need to do, if you see danger, instead of focusing on the danger, what you need to do, and he actually physical, he said, you need to turn your head. You need to turn your attention. And by doing that, the entire car starts moving in that direction where you're focusing your attention. I see the same thing happening in negotiations. When we're focusing too much on price, we sometimes get into a road wreck. But when we start to redirect our attention towards a solution, the outcome, what we're trying to achieve, then the entire focus leads us towards the creation of that solution. And if we do that, we always have to go first. If we can change our mind in that direction, it's easier to help our counterpart that we're negotiating with to go into that direction as well. So it's going away from price as a sort of hypnotic focus towards a value focus. What's the solution we want to create? What's the outcome we want to create? What's the effect? When we do that, it's extremely powerful. So over the years, I found a lot of people have been through trainings, but very often what happens there is a lot of the training happens at the conscious level, and we're negotiating at the conscious intellectual level. But what happens when we do that is, if I try to convince my counterpart intellectually, what I typically get as a response is a bunch of questions. We need a demonstration, quotation, information, documentation, validation, certification, but there's no decision. So decision theory says that most decisions are actually made at a purely subconscious level first. Actually, Mr. Kahneman, who's a professor and Nobel Prize winner, he wrote a book called Thinking Fast and Slow. It's a bestseller. In his research, he found that our subconscious is way faster in thinking than our conscious. And so our subconscious is already fielding questions, it's already checking the environment, it's identifying danger, it's making decisions way before we intellectually have been able to process what might be coming up next and how we should decide to move forward. So the subconscious is making decisions at a gut level, we could say. And then we post-rationalize those decisions with a logical justification in our minds. The decision happens down here subconsciously, and then we articulate it and justify it consciously. According to Kahneman, 95% of our decisions happen that way. So if we're trying to deal with price pressure, and we're doing this at a primarily intellectual, conscious level, we're probably not going to do a good job. We're probably not going to get out of that price squeeze. What Kahneman suggests is you need to focus and speak to the subconscious mind. Actually, he says, if you're not getting an appropriate decision, you're probably speaking to the wrong mind. I find that fascinating because when I'm doing real deal negotiations, one of the key things I've started to look at, and I learned that from Mr. Kahneman, is we often in negotiations try to focus on success, on successful outcomes, and that's great because our conscious mind, our intellect likes that. It's tantalizing, it likes to play with those ideas. But the subconscious is programmed for survival. And so it's programmed to avoid risk, danger, problems, issues, loss. And Kahneman and many other researchers have found that most people will do 3 to 4 times more to avoid risks, problems, pain, or a potential loss than to achieve a gain. I found many people, when they're trying to argue why a price increase is okay and why this should be acceptable to the buyers, they're coming up with all kinds of arguments which speak mainly to the intellect, not to the subconscious. I see a lot of buyers on the other side also trying to justify and convince the other party, the sellers they're negotiating with, at an intellectual level, and very often that fails. So what am I trying to say here? If we're trying to negotiate a way out of a price squeeze, then maybe we need to go beyond the logical argumentation. Actually, it's a two-step approach. We have found that you first need to speak to the subconscious mind and show it that you've understood the risks, you've identified them, you've mitigated the risk. Your solution actually helps them to avoid a loss, a problem, a risk, a danger. And then as a second step, you need to help them with that post-rationalization, which means you need to give them a logical argumentation why this will be good for them and their business, but also a convincing story or storyline, something that will help them internally with their stakeholders to justify their recommendation about why we should go forward with this solution. And this is true for both buyers and sellers. Both sides, if they want to break through a blocked price negotiation, need to first address those risk aversion elements, need to show that there's a way in which we can mitigate or manage that risk, and then as a second step, provide the other side with a logical argumentation and a convincing story that they can use internally in their organization to convince their stakeholders, their supervisors, their decision makers. I have found that very few people actually do that. Before I move on, Mark, I'm talking like crazy here. Do we have any questions yet?
We have not had any questions come in from the audience. So if anyone does have some questions come in, I do have a question though.
Go ahead.
And it goes back to, so from our poll result, what aspect of negotiation do people find more difficult? 57% said being creative. I would imagine this exact point and a challenge in being creative is where it gets so difficult in dealing with price pressure, because we're, as you say, we're going to be working so hard to anticipate that there's going to be challenges to price, right? So we're going to want to prepare for that because we want to avoid that challenge. But really, it requires us to be creative, to think about how it matters to the other audience,
very good,
the other party. And so that how can somebody get past that stumbling block of maybe perceived challenges with creativity?
And you're not going to like my answer. I have found you have to change your mind first before you can help others to change theirs. And so what I found is if I'm a salesperson and I'm anticipating price pressure, I'm sort of wary that my counterpart, the buyer, will try to squeeze me. I might try and come up with all kinds of arguments and defensive tactics and strategies. And we have found that actually it's okay, but it's not often helpful. If as a buyer, I'm wary that because of the market situation, the war in Europe, the disrupted supply chains, whatever, the sellers are going to try to increase our prices, we might get into that combative mode as well. And initially, a bit of combat is okay. But we have found very often the challenger sale or the hard negotiation actually limits our ability to be creative. So one of the best things we need to do in going into negotiations is to raise our level of curiosity, which is what Red Bear does with this three-dimensional model. I call it the dialectic model. This has been around for about 2,000 years. And it's something that we use a lot, because if I'm wary of the other side trying to impose a price increase or getting a price discount, I might be very focused on my self-interest. I might get very competitive. I might get defensive or aggressive. On the other hand, if I'm scared that I might lose the business, I might be overly nice and passive. But both of those aspects aren't good because they put us into what we call fight or flight mode. And interestingly, whether we're in fight mode or in flight mode, we're not thinking clearly and we're not thinking creatively. There's a great book by Mr. Dobelli. It's called The Art of Thinking Clearly. If you're having problems with creativity, get the book. So The Art of Thinking Clearly is about, we need to be careful that we don't go to either extreme here, where we're overly aggressive or overly passive, because in those minds, when we're in a fight mode or a flight mode, all of the blood is going to our periphery. We're either getting ready to run away or we're getting ready for a punch out. But we're not really thinking clearly. We're in reaction mode, we're instinctive. So one of the best things that we found at Red Bear is to engage to a level where we have constructive tension or cognitive tension, and then to take this to a creative dimension. So it's not me having to come up with solutions to defend myself against the price increase. It's not me who's to come up with ideas about how to impose a price increase. It's actually better for us to engage and then co-create that solution. And that co-creation is the key. It usually happens through a series of dialogue points, of conversations. We call this the principle of reciprocity, where it's giving and getting in a level, a high degree of tension, where you're very, very focused on trying to find a solution together. And you're moving away from your default thought patterns towards a more open, clear way of thinking, where you say, so what opportunities do we have? What might a solution look like? And we're both investing into that process. We both have a sense of ownership of what we're developing, and we're getting to a place where we have creativity, but it's together. So it's not me having to create a solution for the buyer. It's not the buyer having to create a solution for the seller. It's this process of co-creation. There's a psychologist called Mr. Csikszentmihalyi. Don't ask me to spell that name. He wrote a book on flow, F-L-O-W. And that is about how to get into peak performance. Again, I'm throwing out a lot of names on books, but this is about how to get together to that peak state through a series of interactions which lead to a better outcome. Mark, a very long answer, but just before I move on, if you haven't read the book by Robert Cialdini on how to co-create solutions, how to use the principle of reciprocity, the book is called The Psychology of Persuasion, or How to Improve Your Influence. I strongly suggest you look at that. Creativity is not something you have to go to art classes for. It's not something where you have to sit in a yoga posture and do It's really about engaging, allowing that cognitive tension to go, where you're saying, I'm having to defend my interest, the interest of my company, but I also see that I need to manage the relationship, and I really want to continue working with this client. And so I can either defend my self-interest or I can work on the relationship. But for my mind, it's really hard to do both at the same time. And when your brain starts going tilt, 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 I go, hallelujah. That's the point. When your brain is going, I can't process this with my standard way of thinking, hang in there, because that is the point where if you hang in there with your counterpart and continue fighting, you start moving towards that creative dimension. So Heraclito developed the dialectic model of negotiation. He said one of the key things to do is to stay in the tension long enough until your mind starts sorting for solutions. And if you're doing this with a counterpart, the two of you are actually working your way towards a breakthrough, a concept that neither of you could have come up with before you started. That sounds esoteric, I know. It's not. It's actually very, very powerful. So, 3 tips around this. One of the key things we found when you're negotiating prices is you actually need to engage in the fight first. You need to create a certain level of tension, but also some common ground with your counterpart. And then you need to orchestrate and increase that level of tension, maybe even a little bit artificially, by combining a series of demands or requests with a series of trades where giving and getting build on each other step by step. And that is something that leads you automatically to a more creative way forward. The second thing that we found is that very often people are focused too much on, so how much do we need to give? This global head of sales in this European company that had been given the ultimatum of giving us a 10% discount by Thursday or else. Well, actually, what I found when we discussed this with her, the 10% was just a number. When she started having a conversation with the client, instead of just complying with their request about what they were trying to achieve, they found out that really it was a cost reduction measure that was being applied across the board to all their suppliers in that client organization. And she said, what if I can help you to save more than 10%? Would you allow me to keep my prices where they are if I can help you to create the cost savings you're really tasked to create? And you know what? They agreed. Does it always happen? No, nothing always happens. But it's interesting that if you start having those deeper conversations about the root cause of an issue, it leads you to better and more creative outcomes, which leads to the last one. When you're getting into this trading mode, I see that sometimes people want to move too fast. I was doing a training this morning, and when we were sort of looking at this real deal negotiation, the real life negotiation, and I role played it with one of the participants just to see how they would play this out in real life. This guy was making demands and offering trades like I couldn't even say much. He was going way too fast. So what we found is you need to slow down, make a demand, make a strong request, and shut up. Let the other side respond. And then maybe the tension level goes up to an unbearable level. So offer them a trade and say, look, if you give me this, then this is what I'll give you in return. And play with that tension. Actually orchestrate the tension. That's the key to creativity. Now, if you are having a hard time with that, again, read Robert Cialdini's book on the psychology of persuasion. A large part of the book is really about how to manage this principle of reciprocity, how to create real reciprocal creativity where both sides are engaged and invested. Why I like this concept is that I found whenever we use it, this dialectic principle from Red Bear, the commitment levels go up, people feel more invested in the outcome, and they have a greater sense of ownership, which for me has often translated into better compliance in the implementation phase. People actually are more behind it. They are more engaged and committed if they feel that they've had a say in the creation of the solution. So don't create a solution for your client, create it with them. If you're a buyer, don't try to come up with all kinds of creative solutions for your sellers. Create them with them. Much more powerful. So what have I been trying to get across to you as points, as insights around how to deal with price pressure? Well, the first one is that you should, whenever possible, position your negotiation around value creation instead of fighting over price. If you're fighting over price, you're in a very one-dimensional negotiation where it ends up with take it or leave it. Somebody wins, somebody loses. If you're very lucky, there's a win-win. But you know what? Most win-win situations are a bit of a compromise. And I have found many people who go, way, we've got a win-win, and then nothing happens. Nobody actually really works on the implementation phase. So the second thing I'd like to leave you with is you need to maybe reframe and refocus your negotiations. And that starts by reframing your own mindset. changing the way you think about the situation. So if you're thinking apprehensively about a potential price increase, if you're a buyer, that is leading your conversation into a certain direction. If as a salesperson, you've been tasked to implement a price increase and you're worried that actually the other side might want a price decrease, then again, you're in a defensive mode and you're not able to think creatively, or no offense meant, you're probably not able to really think clearly. So change your own mindset first, your frame of mind, and focus on optimizing the solution, the impact, the effect of your deals. And this might translate into optimized return on investment, focusing on how you can help your client organization optimize their total cost of ownership or total cost of use. Or if you're a buyer, help your salespeople that you're negotiating with to create a business case they can take back to their pricing specialist, that they can take back to their head of sales, that will help them to justify why, in your case, the price increase should not be implemented, or maybe why a price decrease is actually acceptable. We often don't do this. We're working for ourselves. What we need to do is focus on the others and see, how can we help them? How can we work with them? How can we co-create? And that's my last point here. If you orchestrate the tension level in a good way in your negotiations, this is the key to creativity. A lot of people shy away from tension. They get either overly aggressive or too passive and nice. And what we say you need to do is you need to stay in that middle space, which we call assertive. It's being strong. It's staying in control. It's keeping the prerogative of interpretation of your frame of reference. When you do that, that gives you a large amount of power. And I strongly recommend, if you've listened this far, grab one or two of those books or come to one of the Red Bear courses to learn how to manage that tension, because that is going to be the key if you're under price pressure at this point in time. Mark, I've talked so much, and I think we're at a point where maybe we need to try and get some input from the audience and maybe answer some questions. So
Yep.
Have we got any questions so far?
Yeah, we've had a couple questions come in. So this question came in a couple of formats, and so I'm going to kind of paraphrase it here.
Cool.
Is that how do you recommend helping the situation when your hands are tied as a negotiator? I think of this on the procurement side, when you're needing to get those cost reductions.
Yes.
And the other person isn't really coming off of that defense, when they're not really following these guidelines. How can you help that process take shape?
Okay. So there's two things I would recommend. The first is, if you're focused only on price and you're a buyer and you know you have to get price discounts or decreases, that limits your options tremendously. So if you can take that conversation to a place where with your suppliers and vendors, you're having a cost reduction discussion. How can we reduce cost? That can be around logistics. It can be around payment terms. It can be around, yes, price, but it can be around many other things. So get your blinkers off from the price negotiation and focus on cost reduction measures. What I have found, to my surprise, very often when I do that, the salespeople might be more amenable or open to a price discount. So if I try to push my price reduction objective, I often meet resistance. But if I open up and say, look, it's really about ways of reducing cost, can you help us here? Then very often I end up in a place where I get a range of solutions that help us reduce cost, including some better pricing. And pricing could be in different formats, linked to volume, linked to time, linked to many other parameters that are relevant. So that would be the first thing to do. The second thing that I see most people don't do is they come at the negotiation primarily from their own perspective. So what I always say before trying to push your agenda, and I understand we're under a lot of pressure, so we want to cut to the chase and get a quick deal. It's important to check, where is the other side coming from? What is their reality right now? What are their priorities? And you know what? When you ask them for their priorities, their top priorities usually aren't. One of my clients today said, I'm getting to understand that the issue is not the issue. What people tell me is the main problem is not the main problem because the root cause is below that. So instead of pushing your price agenda, try and ask them. So look, what's your situation right now? What are your priorities? What are you trying to achieve? How can we do this together? It sounds a bit soft, but actually it's very powerful. One more thing, if you ask them for their priorities, just as a little tip, ask them about the order of their priorities. Most people have never thought through the order. And just by asking that question, you're getting them to rethink and reconsider their situation. They might suddenly find, well, actually, for us, it's really important to keep this piece of business with you. So if we're in danger of losing it, then maybe besides other cost reduction measures, maybe we would be willing to do something around the price. So change the conversation, go away from pushing too hard towards a place like in Aikido where you're shifting the energy towards a solution. Long answer. Sorry, Mark.
Yeah,
Any others?
Yeah, we've got a couple of other questions. One last point on that. I think that last point of redirecting, that's something that's so critical that we have is that when we get locked in on that emotional response,
Yes.
rather than redirecting to a more productive line of conversation, that's when a lot of times the train goes off the track, so to speak, and then the mistakes begin to keep coming.
Reminds me of how I got a bloody nose in the karate dojo. Absolutely. Fully confrontational, absolutely no solution. I always lost. So really what I've learned is that redirecting is the thing that gives me better outcomes virtually every time. Other questions?
Yeah. So one other question that we have is when planning for negotiations in advance of negotiations, any advice for getting other folks internally aligned to help create that wide array of ideas for when things kind of shift to that creative, that focus?
Yeah, cool. Well, one thing that I found is on the buyer side, very often, and please, no offense meant if I'm stepping on anybody's toes here, but very often procurement is involved too late. I'm a big fan of early procurement involvement so that we're having an aligned discussion from the get-go. And when we're doing large projects, I always ask, could we have procurement involved here? And I know that a lot of my sales clients say, no, please, we want them as an afterthought. They always create trouble. And I say, no. If you don't involve them properly, you probably will get into trouble. So involve people early. The second thing, which was, I think, really your question, is very often if we're preparing for a negotiation alone or just in a very small team, very often our knowledge of the counterpart is very limited and we stick with what we know. I have found, and this might be very quirky, one of the best things I can do is bring in somebody who really doesn't know the client, somebody who doesn't have everyday contact with the client, or on the other side with the vendor, and ask them to play the devil's advocate and say, look, guys, you seem to be always talking about the same points, but this is stuff you've done before. What if? And sometimes because they're not so close onto the subject, they can see things that we can't. So I always ask for at least one or two people who are slightly more removed from the negotiation to come in and play the devil's advocate. And that has been very, very productive.
That is something that I've found to be very productive as well, is that having that almost purposeful antagonistic viewpoint pushes things in a lot of directions that helps you think through those options.
Exactly.
Another question that came in, is there a tension tipping point that you search for mentally where you know to shift to a more creative posture?
Yes, and there's two or three. There's a good book out all kinds of titles by a guy called Georges Kohlrieser. It's called Hostage at the Table. He's a hostage negotiator and a professor at the IMD in Lausanne in Switzerland, one of the top business schools in Europe. And in the hostage negotiation, he has said what you need to do, and this is the same if you're a buyer with a single source vendor, or it's the same as a salesperson if you're in a negotiation with a major client and you have no leverage. It feels like a hostage negotiation, right? Your hands are tied and you're going, so what? And what Kohlrieser does is he actually takes the tension up. Even if he doesn't have a lot of leverage himself, he actually increases the tension to a place where it's starting to get uncomfortable and people are leaning forward. You actually can see it physically. The physical cues is what I look for. It's when people start leaning forward. It's when people start engaging and people start getting a bit louder. Maybe their sentences become a bit shorter. That's usually the point where I know I have to decrease the tension a bit now. Otherwise, it'll actually become destructive. And I think that probably was the question. There's a tipping point where it's so much tension that if you go above that, the relationship can burst. Maybe just one more thing. I know this sounds like kindergarten. I always have this rubber band with me here. It's a reminder of my guitar. I have several guitars. One of them is a very nice acoustic guitar. When a string bursts, I found that if I put on a new string and I put on too much tension too quickly, it may burst again. So back to the question of the tipping point. I have found I don't find the tipping point immediately. I need to put on some pressure or tension, and then I need to let it settle for a bit. And then I put on a bit more tension, and then I let it settle again. And then I do that a third time, and that leads me to a sense of calibration where I know I can play music now. And for me, that's exactly the same thing in negotiations. I get a sense of I'm at a point now where putting on more pressure is going to have a detrimental or destructive effect, and I can't go beyond that. Now, is this something you can measure scientifically? I don't believe so. I think it's also due to experience. So you may have to practice this for a while until you get to that point where you can actually sense the tipping point. Sorry, long answer again.
That's an excellent point, though. So often negotiation is just not reacting necessarily to the other person, but understanding the back and forth nature of it, just like the diagram that you gave that. And so knowing when and how to apply pressure, knowing when and how to concede helps to get you to that ultimate goal. That's a great point. Yeah,
cool.
That's a great point.
Okay.
Well, I think we've addressed most of the questions that we've got here today. We're finishing up a little bit early. We get to give a little bit of time back to the audience, which is always nice. So,
all right.
Andy, thanks so much for all of this. It was fantastic. A lot of good information there,
Cool.
And it just helps to really help folks who are dealing with price pressure due to all of the different factors that you've mentioned. So again, thank you so much for that.
Thanks for having me.
To our audience, if you could, be sure to give us some feedback and look for upcoming webinars from Red Bear, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.